Hi, today I want to talk about the value of philosophy. We're going to be looking very briefly at an excerpt from Aristotle, a short passage or two from Bertrand Russell, a famous philosopher from the early 20th century. Then we're going to jump over to Albert Camus, the existentialist philosopher, and finally a couple of passages from two scientists, Brian Greene. You may remember him from the string theory film that we saw, and also Edward O. Wilson, a famous Harvard biologist who's known as the father of sociobiology. So, to start off, when we study a particular discipline like accounting or chemistry or nursing, it's usually understood why you're studying it. You study nursing so you can help patients heal. You study chemistry so you can do certain chemical processes. You take a business course so you can learn how to operate a business. But why does one actually study philosophy? It's a fair question. What is the value of philosophy will be the first question we look at. I'm going to jump way, way back in time to Aristotle, who first looked at this question. If you have your handout there on Aristotle, Metaphysics, which is one of his most famous books, he starts off by saying that all men by nature desire to know. So I'm going to try to take these words one at a time. All, he means everyone. This is natural to all people, to all humans. This is something that all people have the capacity to do. All people are inherently curious, although in varying degrees. The second word, men, it is masculine. The Greeks were not known for their, stance on equal rights. But if we were to substitute men for all humans, we would get the same sense, all men and women. So this is something that comes natural to us. We have a desire to know something. Think, for example, of driving down the highway and you see something, perhaps it's an accident by the side of the road. Everybody turns their neck to see what's going on. If you're having a bowl of cereal in the morning, your eyes may gravitate towards the newspaper, towards the television set, or out the window. We're kind of sponges for information. It's natural. It's how we are hardwired. And this is by our nature. That's a very key point here. This is something that's ingrained in our human natures. We could spend many hours talking about the impact of this in terms of the study of human nature. We can't get into that today. But suffice it to say that for Aristotle and for many of the Greeks, this desire to know was a natural thing. Not that everybody exercised this opportunity. Some people, by lack of education or perhaps some other circumstance, might not have the same level of curiosity as other people. But once people are exposed to this, this focus on learning, this focus on curiosity, is somewhat contagious. The word desire, I'm not going to get too much into that. It comes from deep down inside. It's what we want to do. It's something that is, again, basic to our natures. All men and women, by their natures as cognitive human beings, and he didn't talk about animals and other species, so we'll leave that alone for now, have this innate natural desire. The word natural is very important here, to know certain things. And the last two words, to know something. The Greeks had several different words pertaining to knowledge. Here we're just going to look at knowledge as the focus on understanding something about the universe. So if the focus is on knowing about our world, and if this is in fact natural, then not to participate in this process is not living up to your fullest human potential. Some of you have studied psychology. You may have encountered Abraham Maslow, who talked about the hierarchy of needs. and the concept of self-actualization. The Greeks had a very similar concept called eudaimonia or eudaimonia, which is the idea of happiness as profound self-fulfillment. And we obtain this happiness as profound self-fulfillment. We become the fullest humans that we can become because of our intellectual capacity. It is this which separates us from all the other species. A golden retriever lying under a tree on a hot summer day might be really enjoying it. You know, he's saying, it's pretty happy here being a golden retriever lying under a tree. I don't know why my master comes home at 4 o'clock every day. And you can have a good life as a dog, but that golden retriever will never ask, why is it that my owner comes home every day at 4 o'clock? Why is it that there are trees? Or for that matter, why is it that I'm a golden retriever in the first place? These are questions that are unique to humans, okay? The next section in Aristotle, the passage I gave you to look at, talks about knowledge as being focused upon a means to an end, or knowledge for its own sake. Knowledge that is pursued for a means to an end, we might call that instrumental knowledge. You study accounting so you can keep the books of a company. You study real estate so that you can someday sell property. But there are other things that we study because they are innately interesting and they have no practical application. There's a similarity here between what we might call pure science and applied science. You know, pure science, for example, Einstein trying to penetrate the mysteries of gravity, for example, would be pure science. Trying to create a certain, mechanism by which people can, evaluate, blood tests in a hospital would be applied science. So it's not unlike that. Aristotle, in this short handout, talks about the beginnings of philosophy with the pre-Socratics, and we've already talked about those people, so I won't go into that again, but he goes back to the very beginning of the philosophical tradition, to people like Thales. And finally, I just want to call your attention to one of my favorite passages. This is on page 692, second paragraph. He says, that it is not a science of production is clear even from the history of the earliest philosophers. For it is owing to their wonder that men both now begin and at first began to philosophize. And the key point there is that philosophy begins historically at a certain point in time, the ancient Greek world. And philosophy also begins in each one of us when, at a certain age, children may start asking difficult questions of their parents. Why are there suns and stars and moons and things like that? Children are very capable of very precocious questions. But this is the beginning of philosophy. Philosophy begins in wonder. That's why we started our semester with the string theory video. I can't think of anything that creates a deeper sense of wonder about what reality actually is than the contemporary study of theoretical physics, in particular string theory. I'm going to jump over to Bertrand Russell, who in 1912 wrote a very small book, a very important book, called The Problems of Philosophy. And this is the last chapter in that book. It was meant to be for a popular audience. Many of his things were much, much more technical in nature. If you have this handy, you'll know that on the first page towards the bottom, he says that utility does not belong to philosophy. Philosophy, in other words, is not useful in the way that things like real estate studies or nursing or chemistry or accounting might be useful. And that's perhaps true. I do think, though, that Aristotle may have been a little too hard on himself here and on philosophy. This is me now, not Aristotle talking. There are a lot of things that we do in life that are not particularly useful. I'll give you an example. Supposing you're driving home tomorrow and you see a beautiful sunset. You pull your car over to the side of the road, you take your cell phone out, and you snap a beautiful picture of a wonderful sunset. You might actually post it to Facebook, or maybe you'll blow it up into a large poster. You may, at some point in life, fall in love. Love is not particularly useful if by utility we mean it has some kind of cash value. You may enjoy going with friends to a concert. That's not particularly useful. You may want to start learning how to play a musical instrument, the piano or the guitar. That's wonderful, but it's not particularly useful. You may enjoy having friends over for dinner and lingering over dinner with a nice glass of wine and lots of conversation that goes on for hours. Lots of fun, but not particularly useful. The question here is backwards. The question isn't whether these things are useful. None of us would want to live a life that didn't have beautiful sunsets, that didn't have love, that didn't have music, that didn't give us a chance to play music, that didn't give us an opportunity to linger with friendship at a dinner party. These are the reasons why we live, so we can do these things. These things make us human. To ask what's their usefulness is to be asking the wrong question. I'm suggesting that asking what's the usefulness of philosophy might also be the wrong question. If Aristotle is correct, and that philosophy is natural to us because we have curiosity, then asking what the utility of philosophy is kind of beside the point. I'll let that go for now. I'll let you think about that some more. Moving on farther into the Bertrand Russell essay, I am on page 155 right now. At the bottom of the page, there's a very interesting passage where he asks some rhetorical questions, all pertaining to philosophy. He asks, has the universe any unity of plan or purpose, or is it a fortuitous concourse of atoms? Is consciousness a permanent part of the universe, giving hope of indefinite growth in wisdom, or it is a transitory accident on a small planet on which life must ultimately become impossible? Are good and evil of importance to the universe, or only to man? These are some of the deepest, most profound questions in philosophy. And this is really the focus of what Bertrand Russell is trying to get at. These questions may not be answerable, but to ask the question is to be exercising your full humanity. That's what he's trying to get at. I'm going to jump a little farther on. I'll be looking at the bottom of page 156, where Russell is kind of moving to a conclusion here. He says, the value of philosophy is, in fact, to be sought largely in its very uncertainty. We study philosophy not because it gives us fixed answers like accounting would do. I would hope accounting gave us a definite answer. Either your checkbook balances or it does not. You know, these things are either one way or the other. They're black or white. But definitive answers to the meaning of life, to the role of consciousness in the world, these things don't come with an easy answer. He goes on. He says, the man who has no tincture of philosophy goes through life imprisoned in the prejudices derived from common sense, from the habitual beliefs of his age or his nation, and from convictions which have grown up in his mind without the cooperation of consent of his deliberate reason. To such a man, the world becomes definite, finite, and obvious. Common objects rouse no questions. And, this is the perspective of the person who might say, I'm not going to engage in anything unless it has a cash value to me. What's the value in this? How does this help my bottom line? But as Aristotle suggested, so too is Russell suggesting that these people are limited in their outlook. They may not be as developed intellectually in the sense of human curiosity as they might be. They're kind of locked into these little boxes. I'm moving on a little farther as we conclude this little article by Russell, moving to the very end of this chapter, page 161, the very last paragraph of this very short essay. He says, philosophy is to be studied not for the sake of any definite answers to its questions, since no definite answers can, as a rule, be known to be true, but rather for the sake of the questions themselves. Because these questions enlarge our conception of what's possible, enrich our intellectual imagination, and diminish the dogmatic assurance which closes the mind against speculation. But above all, because through the greatness of the universe, which philosophy contemplates, the mind also is rendered great. So a couple of things here. First of all, there are no answers to a lot of these questions, but that's to be asking the wrong questions. Our minds become great by asking these questions. I refer to this as the concept of the transformative power of the question. Even if we don't have an answer to certain questions, to just raise the question elevates us as curious individuals, and makes philosophy worthy of study. As far as rendering the universe great here at the end, our minds are become great by asking great profound questions, even if there are no answers. We could spend our days talking about what's going on in Washington, or the latest gossip about the Kardashians and things like that. These things ultimately don't amount to very much. The mind is rendered great by tackling, even without an answer, by tackling the greatest questions of the universe. So there you have it. You have Aristotle from 2,500 years ago almost, and you have Bertrand Russell from about 100 years ago. I want to shift gears just a little bit in terms of where philosophy is in the late 20th century. There are different traditions, and I want to start off by looking at Albert Camus. And if you have the Myth of Sisyphus handout on standby, you can look at the excerpts from these two particular essays. The first one is called An Absurd Reasoning. This is the first chapter in a book he wrote called The Myth of Sisyphus. We'll look at the story, The Myth of Sisyphus, in a minute. Camus asks, in the very beginning, it's a very provocative introduction here, there is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy. All the rest, whether or not the world has 3 dimensions, whether the mind has 9 or 12 categories, comes afterwards. These are games one must first answer. Now, what does he mean here? He's not talking about suicide as a psychological or a psychiatric condition. Obviously, suicide is a serious problem. What he's asking here is something different. Is the fact that we usually don't commit suicide, as a matter of course, indicates that our lives have a deep down value to us. Should that value not be the starting point of philosophy? Camus says yes. In fact, all the existentialists would say yes to that. Other questions, like how many dimensions in the world, does the mind have 9 or 12 categories? That's a reference to Immanuel Kant, by the way. We'll look at him later in the semester. These things come on later. The primary question, the first question of philosophy should be, what is the meaning of my existence? What is the meaning of human existence? Everything else comes afterwards. Camus and all the other existentialist philosophers have had a huge impact on the mid-20th century and the late 20th century. Even today, a lot of people enjoy reading the existentialists because they talk about the meaning of life, which for a lot of people, that's the essence of philosophy. Um, so I want to move a little bit beyond this and just flesh out a few more ideas from Camus before I contrast Camus to another perspective. Camus continues in the next paragraph. I've edited this myself, so you'll see that there's an ellipsis there. I've edited out some stuff. At any street corner, the feeling of absurdity can strike any man in the face. Camus was one of those writers, and he was a philosopher, but he also wrote essays. He also wrote novels. Many of you may have read The Stranger by Camus. He's focused very much on absurdity and the idea that existence itself is absurd. And of course, that's a big question if we're talking about the meaning of life. I'm going to jump over to the third page on the handout that I gave you with a paragraph that begins with the words, "It happens." It happens that the stage set collapses. Rising, streetcar, 4 hours in the office or the factory. Meal, streetcar, 4 hours of work. Meal, sleep, and Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, according to the same rhythm. This path is easily followed most of the time. But one day, the why arises, and everything begins in that weariness tinged with amazement. Begins. This is important. Weariness comes at the end of the acts of a mechanical life. But at the same time, it inaugurates the impulse of consciousness. It awakens consciousness and provokes what follows. Very, very good passage here. Very, very well written, obviously. And what he's suggesting here is that the experience of absurdity can pop up in our minds, especially when we find ourselves stuck in a rut, the mechanical nature of our day-to-day lives. But this awareness of absurdity is not necessarily a negative thing. This is the starting point of consciousness. In other words, self-awareness. It's this self-awareness that has to begin before we can do anything about this. The idea here that absurdity is the human condition, but that our consciousness of this rises above is fundamental to a number of existentialist writers. I'm going to jump over to the second essay. The first essay, by the way, I edited that severely. It's actually very, very long. I just gave you a few pages from it. This next one, the myth of Sisyphus, is actually the entire essay. And I'm not going to read the entire thing. I will assume that you have read that. Sisyphus is a character from Greek mythology who's condemned to an eternity of rolling a heavy boulder up a hill, only to have the boulder roll back down. And then he has to go back down the mountain and push the boulder again to the top. It's kind of a view of hell, really, if you think about it. Many of us, if you have a very routine, life at work, may think about this. If I can relate to that, my life is rolling one boulder up the hill after another, and that's why Camus chose this as a metaphor, as an analogy for our day-to-day lives. He says that Sisyphus here is the absurd hero, but a hero, that's the important point. Sisyphus, he says, is greater than his fate. In this particular article, in this particular story, Camus gives us his view of what it means to be human. And this connects, of course, to the question of existence that we've been looking at previously. I want to look quickly at the bottom of the very first page here, which is page 4 in your handout. One sees merely the whole effort of a body, straining to raise the huge stone, to roll it and push it up a slope 100 times over. One sees the face screwed up the cheek tight against the stone, the shoulder bracing the clay-covered mass, the foot wedging it, the fresh start with the arms outstretched, the wholly human security of two earth-clotted hands. At the very end of his long effort, measured by skyless space and time without depth, the purpose is achieved. Then Sisyphus watches the stone rush down in a few moments towards the lower world, whence he will have to push it up again towards the summit. He goes back down to the plain. It may sound kind of frustrating to us, but listen to what Camus says next. It is during that return, that pause, that Sisyphus interests me, he writes. A face that toils so close to stones is already stone itself. He says he sees Sisyphus going down the hill with a certain kind of an energy, and he ends this paragraph by saying that Sisyphus is superior to his fate. He is stronger than his rock. Why is that the case? Well, he has understood the human condition, and he is up to the task. It's in understanding the human condition, by becoming conscious of the human condition, and indeed embracing its absurdity, that he becomes fully human. Next paragraph, he writes, if this myth is tragic, that is because its hero is conscious. There's an argument to be made that all tragic literature comes out of self-consciousness. If I were to take a stone and put it on my desk here and smash it with a hammer, the stone is not going to suffer, it won't cry. But when you have a sentient being, if you have a creature like humans who are self-conscious, then we do have suffering. But to be a creature that can suffer, you have to have self-awareness. Consciousness, some scholars have suggested, is heightened self-awareness. And I think that's true if you look at that in terms of psychoanalysis and psychology and other disciplines as well. Continuing with the passage here. The workman of today works every day in his life at the same tasks, and his fate is no less absurd. But it is tragic only at the rare moments when it becomes conscious. And so this idea of a tragic awareness means that we all share in this tragedy of the human condition. But it's not necessarily a negative tragedy. It can be positive, because it's through this tragedy that we can understand the human condition. You can make some connections here to Christianity as well. The last passage I'll jump to quickly at the very end, the last paragraph on this myth of Sisyphus. Very, very elegant in terms of the writing. Each atom of that stone, each mineral flake of that night-filled mountain in itself forms a world. The struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. Happy. We would think that Sisyphus would be depressed, doomed, angry, but he's happy. But why would he be happy? And we can disagree with Camus, of course. He's happy, suggests Camus, because he is self-aware. He understands the human condition. He accepts his humanity and the fate that has been given to him. This is kind of a parable for the human condition, which many of the existentialist philosophers and playwrights and novelists will share. So I wanted to share that with you because it's very, very provocative. It's one of the great passages in Western literature of the 20th century. But I want to end by looking at two other passages very quickly. The first one is called The Fabric of the Cosmos by Brian Greene. You remember Brian Greene from the string theory video. He's written a few books, and this one deals with time and space, Fabric of the Cosmos. And he says on the very first page of this handout here that I gave you, he talks about how he was reading Camus as a young man, looking at his father's library. And he's, there's but one truly philosophical problem, and that's suicide. And he says, wow, this is pretty heavy stuff. What does he mean by this? And at the bottom of that very first page, Brian Greene writes, You can ponder this or analyze that till the cows come home, but the real question is whether all your ponderings and analyses will convince you that life is worth living. That's what it's all about. And then he thinks about this and he says, wait a minute, there might be a different approach to this. He says on page 4 that Camus' conclusion strikes him as being somewhat off the mark. He ends up arguing at the bottom of page 4 that the study of physics or the study of neuroscience or the study of biology, these things are not just details, as Camus talks about it, but ways that we can understand why humans are the way we are, so that we can even ask the question of existence. I'll quote from page 5 here, second paragraph. He says, to one extent or another, this view of reality is one many of us hold, if only implicitly. I certainly find myself thinking this way in day-to-day life. Then farther on he says, I've learned that modern science tells a very different story. The overarching lesson that has emerged from scientific inquiry over the last century is that human experience is often a misleading guide to the true nature of reality. Lying just beneath the surface of the everyday is a world we'd hardly recognize. Farther on down again in the next paragraph, he says, I remain as convinced now as I did decades ago that Camus rightly chose life's value as the ultimate question. But the insights of modern physics have persuaded me that assessing life through the lens of everyday experience is like gazing at a Van Gogh, a famous artist, through an empty Coke bottle. And so this raises a question. If we study science, physics, neuroscience, biology, can these help us understand human reality? The answer is yes, I think it can, but it's a different starting point. Some philosophers, Camus, Heidegger, which we dealt with separately, would say that we need to dwell upon the question of the meaning of human existence. But there are others, predominantly scientists, who say, wait a minute, time out, we need to look at science because neuroscience can tell us why our brains are the way they are, such that we can ask the questions related to self-awareness. Our biology can reveal to us the meaning perhaps of our lives. And physics can tell us what's really going on deep down inside. So I want to offer up Brian Greene as kind of a contrast to Camus' approach, especially because he mentions Camus. One final thing from Edward O. Wilson. He's very old now. He's still alive, I think in his late 80s now. He's the father of a discipline called sociobiology, which is the biological study of populations of species of different animals to understand their behavior. As a biologist, he looks for a biological explanation or reduction as to why animals act the way they do. When his book came out in 1975, it was very controversial because he was suggesting, not throughout the book, but at the very beginning and at the very end of the book, that we might be able to apply biology to understanding human issues. And people reacted very negatively to that and think, well, humans are capable of all this abstract thought. Don't tell me it's just a matter of biology. But it's interesting that Wilson also looks at Camus. If you look at the handout, The Morality of the Gene by Edward Wilson, you'll see that the very first word in the first chapter is Camus. Camus said that the only serious philosophical question is suicide. This is wrong even in the strict sense intended, writes Wilson. The biologist realizes that self-knowledge is constrained and shaped by the emotional control centers of the hypothalamus and the limbic system of the brain. These centers flood our consciousness with all the emotions, hate, love, guilt, fear, and others that are consulted by ethical philosophers who wish to intuit the standards of good and evil. So I'm not going to go through the entire 2 pages here, but I want to give you a sense here that there is an alternative approach. I want you to think about this. If you were starting from scratch and you wanted to understand the meaning of human existence, you want to understand why is there something rather than nothing, which is Jim Holt's famous question. Would you start with Camus and Heidegger talking about the meaning of human existence, strictly from a philosophical, perhaps even poetic perspective? Or do you think that something can be said to defend science, whether it's physics or neuroscience or biology, to say, well, I don't think we can get to the question of the meaning of human existence except by studying physics, neuroscience, or biology? I'm not going to take a position on this right now. I just wanted to raise the issue and establish this contrast. This is something you can think about, and I'm looking forward to your thoughts on this. Thank you very much.